The story of Sir Douglas Mawson is not merely a tale of survival. It is perhaps the most harrowing account of human endurance ever recorded in the annals of polar exploration. While his contemporaries Robert Falcon Scott and Roald Amundsen captured the world's imagination with their high-stakes race to the South Pole, Mawson's eyes were fixed on a different, more complex prize: the cold, hard data of the unknown. To understand the man who staggered out of the blizzard in 1913, one must first understand the man who stepped onto the ice in 1911. Born in 1882 in Yorkshire, England, and moved to Australia at the age of 2, Douglas Mawson was a man of the laboratory and the field alike. Mawson was not an adventurer in the Victorian gentleman explorer sense. He was a scientist who saw the Antarctic as the ultimate laboratory. Before leading his own expedition, Mawson had already tested his mettle. In 1907, he joined Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. It was during this journey that Mawson, alongside Edgeworth David and Alistair Mackay, performed the staggering feat of hauling sledges to the South Magnetic Pole, a journey of 1,260 miles. This experience didn't just give him ice blood, it gave him a profound skepticism of the dash for the pole mentality. He saw the South Pole as a geographical vanity project. To Mawson, the real value lay in the thousands of miles of unexplored coastline south of Australia, the territory he would call King George V land and Adderley Land. When Mawson organized the Australasian Antarctic expedition in 1911, he turned down a prestigious spot on Scott's Terra Nova expedition to lead his own. His mission was strictly scientific. While the British and Norwegians were racing for 90 degrees south, Mawson was interested in the great unknown of the Antarctic coastline directly below Australia. The scientific objectives were vast and ambitious. The expedition aimed to map over 2,000 miles of coastline that had never been seen by human eyes. They sought to study the geology of the continent to see if it shared a history with Australia. They planned to conduct extensive meteorological observations to understand the weather forge of the Southern Ocean, which dictated the climate of the Australian mainland. Most importantly, the AAE was a pioneer in technology. Mawson insisted on bringing a wireless telegraphy system, the first ever used in Antarctica, to establish a radio link between the ice and the rest of the world via a relay station on Macquarie Island. This was an expedition designed to bring the Antarctic into the modern age of communication and data. In December 1911, the ship Aurora departed Hobart, Tasmania. Mawson landed his main party at Cape Denison in Commonwealth Bay. He did not know it then, but he had accidentally picked the windiest place on Earth at sea level. The men lived in a wooden hut, often unable to step outside for days as winds regularly exceeded 100 miles per hour. This was the home of the blizzard, a place where the snow didn't fall. It screamed horizontally across the landscape like a solid wall of white. Despite the conditions, Mawson pushed his teams out. The most ambitious of these was the Far Eastern Party, consisting of Mawson himself, a dashing young British officer named Belgrave Ninnis, and a Swiss skiing champion named Xavier Mertz. They set out with 3 sledges and several teams of Greenland Huskies, aiming to explore the territory 300 miles east of their base. The journey began with promise, but on December 14, 1912, the ground simply vanished. Ninnis, the youngest and strongest of the group, was jogging beside his sledge when he crossed a snow-covered crevasse. While Mawson and Mertz had passed over it safely, the weight of Ninnis's sledge which carried the lion's share of their food, their only tent, and the most vital equipment, caused the snow bridge to collapse. Mawson and Mertz ran back to the edge of a blue-black abyss. They peered into a fathomless void. Far below, they saw a single dog moaning on a ledge, its back broken. Of Ninnis, there was no sign. They called into the darkness for hours, but only the wind answered. Ninnis was gone, and with him went 90% of their food and their primary means of survival. They were 315 miles from base, with only 10 days of human food and nothing for the remaining 6 dogs. The retreat was a slow-motion catastrophe. To survive, the men were forced to do the unthinkable. They began to eat their remaining sledge dogs. One by one, as the dogs collapsed from exhaustion, they were slaughtered. However, history often glosses over the shocking detail of their diet. Because the dog meat was stringy and tough, the men saved the livers for last, believing them to be the most nourishing part of the animal. They were unknowingly committing a slow suicide. Husky livers contain toxic levels of vitamin A. As they ate, they were suffering from hypervitaminosis A, a condition that causes the skin to peel, the hair to fall out, and the mind to descend into delirium. Xavier Mertz succumbed first. The world-class athlete became a shadow of himself. He grew delusional, eventually biting off one of his own fingers in a fit of rage before slipping into a fatal coma in January 1913. Mawson was now alone, 100 miles from safety, with his own body literally dissolving. Mawson's condition was gruesome. His skin was falling off in such large blackened sheets that he had to use thick layers of lanolin and bandages to tape the soles of his bleeding stumps back onto his bleeding stumps every morning just to stand. His hair fell out in clumps, and his digestive system was in agony. In a moment of ultimate despair, Mawson fell into a crevasse himself. He was saved only by the fact that his sledge, which he was hauling by hand, caught on the lip of the hole. He dangled in the freezing dark, suspended by a rope, his strength spent. He later wrote in his diary, "I felt it would be a relief to let go and have it over, but something reached out and held me." With a strength born of pure, terrifying will, Mawson spent 4 hours hauling his decaying body back up that rope, inch by agonizing inch. He climbed out of his own grave and continued to crawl towards the base. When Mawson finally reached the cliffs of Cape Denison in February 1913, he saw a sight that would have broken any other man. On the horizon, he saw the Aurora, his rescue ship, sailing away. He was mere hours too late. He stood on the ice, a living ghost with peeling skin and tattered rags, watching his only ticket home disappear into the South Ocean. However, a small search party of 6 men had stayed behind, disobeying orders in the slim hope that Mawson might still be alive. When they saw the figure approaching through the haze, they didn't recognize him. They saw a blackened, skeletal creature that looked more like a specter than the robust leader who had left months prior. Because the ship had departed, Mawson was forced to spend a second full year in Antarctica. This year was perhaps more psychologically taxing than the march itself. He was a broken man, living in a cramped, wind-blasted hut with men who had expected to find his corpse. The atmosphere was strained, a bizarre existence of living ghosts waiting for the ice to melt. Yet even in this state, Mawson's scientific mind never stopped. During that extra year, despite the PTSD, then called polar melancholy, and the physical damage of the vitamin A poisoning, Mawson continued to oversee the scientific work. They survived on hoosh, a thick stew of sledging rations, supplemented by penguin and seal meat. They ate penguin eggs by the hundreds, and this time Mawson was much more careful which organs they consumed. Mawson finally returned to Australia in February 1914 to a hero's welcome. However, a great controversy began to simmer in certain historical circles. Some suggested that Mawson might have intentionally outlived Mertz by taking a larger share of the remaining food during their retreat. Others pointed to the grim possibility that Mertz's death was accelerated by Mawson's insistence on continuing the march. Mawson himself never entertained these whispers. He spent the rest of his life documenting the massive amounts of data collected during the expedition. The results filled 22 volumes,